KP.
KPC.
News.
Information. Culture. KPCC.
California sensibility.
Hi, I'm Amy Choi.
And I'm Rebecca Lehrer, and this is the Mashup Americans.
The Mashup Americanos.
See, Amy, today I want to talk to you about something you might be hearing a lot of in 2016.
Muchas gracias. Mi español es muy peor. Pero yo trato mejor. Hacer mejor.
Bernie Sanders hablas español.
Bernie Sanders, he speaks a little Spanish. It's pretty bad Spanish, but you might like to know that actually Hillary never speaks Spanish in public. And on the Republican side this year, there's amazing Spanish speakers, actually.
Well, yeah. So there's Jeb Bush, who is married to a Mexican woman and taught himself Spanish. He speaks excellently. And Marco Rubio obviously speaks fluently. And then even Rand Paul, who's from Houston, speaks a little Tex-Mex Houstonian Spanglish.
So, por favor, disculpen mi español. Como crecí en Houston, es un poco Spanglish. Un poco Tex-Mex. That's about all I can do, sorry.
But speaking of Spanglish, I speak Spanglish in my house all the time. Well, Gabriel is Latino, and I speak better Spanish than Korean, which we can talk about that some other time.
Yeah, filed under guilt.
Guilt, second, 10th, millionth podcast episode that we can do on that. Well, so we speak Spanish in our house because we are really trying to raise our two kids as Spanish speakers and to be bilingual, hopefully trilingual someday. But does this mean that with all the Spanglish we got that my baby could be president?
You mean Senor Calabacin? Yeah. He could, well, also because he's American. And so we have another 33 years for him to become the presidente.
So he's 2.5, Senor Pumpkin. The most used phrases in our house right now are, you have to aguardar those toys, and don't forget to quita los zapatos, which is basically put away your toys and take off your shoes.
Right.
So we're also very bossy.
Muy bossy. Well, you definitely aren't the only ones. There have never been this many people in the U.S. who go home and speak Spanish. There are almost 36 million of them, /us. And so there's about 320 million people in America, which means 1 out of every 10 people, when they go home, are looking for leche, not milk. They're talking to their niños about aguardaring sus toys. All of that. You're not the only ones.
Well, I hope not, because I hope everybody is talking to their niños about aguardaring sus toys and then giving them easy crema at the end of the day.
Easy crema? What's easy crema?
Easy crema is obviously Spanglish for ice cream.
Yes.
I think that, we could say helado, but that's just not that fun.
No.
Easy crema.
Easy crema is much better. Well, there's lots of really interesting wrinkles in these numbers, which we got from Pew and the census. Among the many interesting trends is that a lot more Latinos are using English, in part because more Latinos are born in the U.S. And since our country is this big old mashup of English and Spanish, I went to talk to the world's expert in Spanglish, Ilan Stavans.
Ilan Stavans, I can't wait.
Ilan Stavans, you are our guest today, so please introduce yourself.
Mi nombre es Ilan Stavans. Ich rede Yiddish, beaniv me da very Brit, and I often use English, pero me gusta mixing the ganze Megille and engage with people at different levels depending on the circumstance, and often me gusta romper fronteras o desafiar and be challenged and challenging with my language.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you mash up?
I am originally from Mexico. I have been in the United States, where I came as an immigrant from the 1980s on. I am a writer and a translator and an essayist and a publisher, and have a passion for language, for how language changes, for different types of languages, for the evolution of a language as connected with the ideas that we have about nation and about religion and about society in general. So I'm interested in how words are time capsules that tell us a lot about where we've been, who we are, where we're going.
Well, that's actually one of the main principles of what we're talking about with the Mashup Americans. It's wonderful to hear you talk about it. And if we narrow in a little bit on Spanglish, which I like to say is my best language, how would you define it?
I would say that Spanglish is both the marriage and the divorce, not only of two languages, two standardized languages, English and Spanish, or Spanish and English, but also of two civilizations, of the Anglo civilization, the English language culture that came from England and spread through imperial efforts throughout the world, and Spanish from Spain, and they did exactly the same maneuver. The result is a new language. The result is not an in-between. It's not as if we are in the middle, somewhere between Spanish and English. We have created something altogether new. I think it's the mestizaje, the hybrid mix element of Latin American culture that is very much a part of this. And it is announcing not only a new way of talking, but a new way of thinking and a new way of being, and as a result, an entirely new civilization that is part this and part that, part Anglo, part Hispanic, but it's altogether fresh and new.
Right. And who speaks Spanglish in America?
Well, Spanglish is not only spoken in America. Spanglish is spoken the world over by people in Latin America, in Spain, who by all sorts of, because of all sorts of reasons that have to do with work, that have to do with entertainment, that have to do with travel, need to mix, to juxtapose Spanish and English. But of course, the main center is the United States, where we are between 50 and 60 million Latinos. This is a huge population. It's a larger number than the population of Spain, the population of Argentina. It is a new nation within the nation, the United States, of Latinos, you could describe them. And it is also a language that allows us to communicate with other immigrant groups and with the mainstream in general. So I would say that Spanglish is used in all sorts of spheres, in television, in radio, in music. Music is at the vanguard of what Spanglish is all about. In education, in the classroom, on the street, in restaurants, in labor spaces. And it used to be seen, it used to be looked down at illegitimate, untrustworthy, and it is now something hip and cool and attractive.
Yeah. And what's sort of your favorite Spanglish word or phrase you find yourself the most commonly using?
I have many. I am often asked that question, and I have many. I love words like guachale, which means watch out or take care or pay attention, depending on the context that you're in. I love words that are in Spanglish, but can be also put in the context of how Spanish gets transformed, like aplicación for what you do when you apply to the university or to a college, when in fact you're using words like in Spanish inscribirse or suscribirse a una revista, parquear. I love words like marqueta, laborar or laburar, rufo, liquear, migra.
When I think about it and the way you're describing it, that there are different pieces of Spanglish. There are English words that become Spanishized, if that's the right way to frame it. There's a combination, when you were first speaking, a sentence that is, in Español y in English. So you sort of mixing, quote unquote, proper Spanish or proper English in the same sentence. And then my understanding is there's also something called calques, if that's the right way to describe it, which are a word-for-word translation from one language to another. So I'm interested in kind of the mix of those, and if you've found if there are words that are more likely to be, if I'm speaking Spanglish, then I'm more likely to use in Spanish in a sentence than I would than to use the English version.
Spanglish can be understood or can be appreciated by recognizing three different strategies that a speaker or a listener will have. One of the strategies is code switching, what the sociolinguists describe as the coming and going between one language and the other. This is usually done in a single sentence, or sometimes, as I was saying at the beginning, a sentence in English and a sentence in Spanish. This results when languages live in contact, like in the major urban centers of the United States, where you have populations that speak Spanish and populations that speak English, and then you have people that have to navigate those two realms. So a natural way would be to empezar una frase in English and switch a la otra, back and de regreso, dependiendo de the circumstance in which you are. And no two code switchers will code switch in the exact same way. One can start in Spanish, the other one will start in English. The key to the success is that the listener, the person who's interacting with the speaker, will be able to understand that code switching in the same way and not get lost. There are words that the code switchers have created as a middle ground that no longer belong to either Spanish or English. And that was what the dictionary that I was trying to put together, that I did put together, was all about 6,000 words that are like carpeta. Carpeta in a Spanish dictionary will be like the book you use, the notebook you use for school, but in the Spanglish dictionary, it will be a carpet or Clickear or the ones that we've been talking about. But there's another strategy too, and the third strategy is to think in one language and to communicate in the other. You don't have to use English in Spanish to be speaking in Spanglish.
Right.
You have to be thinking in English and communicating in Spanish. And that means that you're using certain formations or certain patterns of a language that are not used in the other. For instance, today it has become quite common to say que tenga buen día. But the truth is that in Spanish we say buenos días, o que la pase bien, okay. But when you say que tenga buen día, the truth is you spend enough time in the United States to be translating from English into Spanish, have a good day. And somebody from the Spanish-speaking world will feel that there's something awkward when you're doing that you don't quite belong to the Spanish-speaking world. So that is the kind of simultaneous translation that plays with the fact that you exist in another reality. You're thinking in a different way.
Coming up, we'll hear more from Ilan Stavans, including an amazing story about how he turned Sábado Gigante, the crazy late-night show, into a laboratory for language experiments.
And if you're liking this podcast, we have one quick thing to ask you. Please go to iTunes or your favorite podcast app and give us a 5-star rating. We are basically brand new, and your love helps us spread the love to new listeners. Thanks.
So if I'm looking for a tablecloth in my house, the first thing I always say to my mainly English-speaking husband is, honey, where's the mantel? I actually cannot summon the word in English for this very normal thing. Like, I can something about it. What's going on there?
Well, what's going on there is that we use language depending on our immediate environment and how the environment can be just the house where you are with your husband, or the way that that particular word has been used by your mother and by your grandmother and has been applied to a way of looking nostalgically at artifacts that come from your past. The impact that the media has on us defines often how we use certain words.
Speaking of calques, it's one of my aunts does this, because especially in El Salvador, there's a lot of making diminutives, right? Mm-hmm. And so she said, un cigarrito, but then in English, she'll be like, I'm just going to have a little cigarette.
Right, which is never that little, right?
Took me a long time to figure out that it was just a translation from the Spanish.
But of course, this also has a kind of culturally and politically charged element, because in Spanish we can use diminutives for aspects of our culture that we don't feel are offensive. For instance, la gordita, or el negrito, or el chinito to describe somebody from China or somebody from Africa or somebody who is large. But then when we translate that into English, it becomes politically charged, particularly in a politically correct environment like we've been living in. And that is something that in Spanglish can become explosive.
You know, as we see more awareness and fluency in Spanish nationwide, right, and going around the world, how do you see this evolving? How do you see, have you seen any major changes in the last, 5 years?
I have seen substantial changes, and I am very happy with those changes because they are proof that the language police cannot control this most free and democratic of expressions, which is the way we engage with one another through words. When I first arrived to the United States in the 1980s, the feeling was that even the word Spanglish denoted a lack of education, a resistance to learn the English language, that you were not part of this country. But today, there are corporations that are using Spanglish all the time in order to create their commercials. There are politicians that give their speeches, and priests and other religious figures that use Spanglish for their sermons. And Spanglish is everywhere. Spanglish has become hip and hype and very attractive. And it is in Hollywood movies, it is on radio, it is in literature. We have literature now in Spanglish that has to be translated into Spanish or into English to be fully understood if we want that. And that means that there is a dramatic cultural change. The gravitas is changing. Every single immigrant group that has come to the United States has mixed languages at some point. For 10 years, for 15 years, there was something called Yiddish and English, or Chinglish, or Franglais.
I heard that you have a great story about Don Francisco from Sábado Gigante, and a little bit about his influence on Spanglish, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
I was invited a couple of times to be in Sábado Gigante or in the other shows that Don Francisco was in. Don Francisco is originally from Chile, and he is a Yiddish speaker, as I am. And so when we met in the dressing room, we communicated in Yiddish with one another, and it was a pleasure, and it was both surprising and curious, because there you have two Latin Americans, the result of immigration from Eastern Europe, from different generations, using a neutral Yiddish, a Yiddish that in and of itself is a middle ground of various origins in what used to be called the Pale of Settlement. And in the conversation that I had with him in Yiddish, it became clear that Yiddish in and of itself is a form of Spanglish, is a mix of different languages, Hebrew and German, but also using Slavic elements and then being contaminated, so to speak, with English. And so then when I went on stage, he introduced me as the destructor, the destroyer of the Spanish language, in a kind of humorous fashion because of my interest and my studies on Spanglish, and then went on to talk about his own passion for Spanglish and how this is a fixture and a feature of the United States. And then he allowed me to play with certain words that I had only, by then I was putting together a dictionary of Spanglish that used colleagues all over the country and scholars and interns and graduate students, and we had identified certain words that were only used in particular locations but had not jumped to other spaces. And one of the missions of a dictionary is to be able to, of a serious professional one, is to include words that are not invented all of a sudden by an individual, but can be replicated and can have established their space. And so the idea was to use some of these words like guachateria and soquete that we had seen in one particular region of the country in the show, and see if they would have an impact in the other parts of the country. and it was fascinating. We used them, and people immediately took to them, and it served as a wonderful opportunity to validate and to study the impact of television in the Spanglish-speaking Latino community in the United States.
I know that in my family, there's a lot of Hebrew and German integrated into the Spanish. But as the person inheriting that and not the native speaker of any of those languages, I didn't know. So, for instance, balagan is a word in Hebrew, right?
Right.
Means craziness, right?
Yeah, or mess.
Right. But I thought it was in Spanish. So for a long time, I would just use it. Ay, que balagan. It's so crazy here, And when I was speaking to Spanish speakers who didn't have this integration or mashup of languages, they had no idea what I was saying. And it took me many years to realize that. And I wonder if you have any things that you didn't realize were, Yiddish words or even Polish or that, that you were using in your Spanish and you're communicating day to day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I always used the word tujes to refer to the back, to the bottom, and my parents used it all the time, and it means you're behind. And I used it with my kids, and my kids always thought that tujes was part of the English language, and when relating to other people, they would say, "Oh, I don't want to see your tujes. Put your pants up." And only until they started realizing that all of us. That you don't live with other Yiddish speakers or with the descendants of Yiddish speakers. Did I remember trying to make it conscious that I needed to use behind or el bot or whatever it is? But then you sometimes, once you've become aware of that, you keep it because you want to have something distinctive in your language. And that happens in my case, with accent. I remember coming to this country with a very limited English and feeling that even listening to my own voice on the voice message, the greetings, was very painful. It's like looking at myself in the mirror and hearing how I was struggling with putting those syllables together. It was so awkward. And now that I've spent all this time in the United States, and now that I feel that English is a home that feels mine, I don't want that awkwardness to fully disappear. And when somebody tells me they can still detect an accent, I would like to amplify it, to make it even more. The other thing that I would like to tell you about this is that the toughest thing for me when learning English was certain expressions that I just couldn't understand. I remember hearing for the first time the expression space cadet. In a conversation, and I knew what space meant and cadet, but I just couldn't understand what the two together. So I asked my wife, and she said, it's somebody who is not paying attention. And I was so proud to finally understand it. And next time, in the middle of a conversation, I wanted to invoke space cadet, but I knew the message and couldn't bring up the sentence, couldn't bring up the two words. So I said something, cloudy commander. And everybody was laughing, and to this day, some people, refer to me as the cloudy commander.
That's so funny. This is so great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for including me.
Bye.
Hasta luego. Que estés
Hasta
bien.
luego.
Debe ser el perfume que usas o el agua con la que te bañas, pero cada cosita que haces a mí.
Ilan Stavans is a professor of Latin American Studies at Amherst and the world's expert in Spanglish.
Me fascina. That was so interesting. And I'd love to learn more about other mashup languages, like Kurenglish. If that's not a thing, I'm inventing it.
Well, it's probably a thing. I mean, don't you speak Kurenglish at your house?
That's true. Well, we have my two favorite words in Korean, which are popo and panku.
What do those words mean?
Well, popo is a kiss, so obviously we use that all the time, like popo or popos and besitos. And then panku is just the cutest word ever in Korean, which is a little hole. Like, I got a panku in my sock. That's something we also say a lot in our home.
I'm sure you do. Well, I'm sure we'll get more Korenglish on future podcasts. In the meantime, check out mashupamericans.com for our tips on raising bilingual kids. A favorite, give your kid a nickname in the second language.
Por ejemplo, Señor Calabaza.
It's true.
The Mashup Americans are me, Amy Choi.
And me, Rebecca Lehrer.
Our show is produced by American Public Media and Southern California Public Radio, KPCC.
We're also supported in part by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts on the web at arts.gov.
CC, que te vayas bien.
Annyeong!
Baby, I'm addicted to you.